Before I start my essay of verbal diarrhea, let me very briefly explain why I'm making this. I have a somewhat unconventional attitude about criticism, seeing it as a generally constructive enterprise analogous to, say, editing writ large. Rarely will I judge a person, artwork, or argument worth the time to criticize if they are themselves not worthy of the time. To put it rather curtly, the kind of idiots and lying shitbags that you routinely ream in your videos simply aren't worth it, apart from the entertainment purposes. Since I'm no one's idea of a particularly entertaining fellow, that leaves me with only critique for ameliorative purposes, hence this video. In short, here's the appropriate disclaimer. Full assumptions about good faith mistakes apply. I'm doing this for fun and intellectual elucidation, not to take the piss out of you or anyone else. For my first criticism, we have the issue of selectivity and gender disparity issues. One example that keeps arising is a disparity in suicides between the genders. Unfortunately, there is no acknowledgement whatsoever given to the disparity between suicides and suicide attempts, the former being disproportionately committed by men, but the latter by women at equal or higher rates than men. Much of this an effect of the methods chosen to commit suicide, or at least attempt to commit suicide. This is relevant to both the narrative, the narrative of the social problems faced by men and women, and how the attendant issues are interpreted and colored rhetorically. Okay, another example of this selectivity, as you can probably see where I'm going with this, is the discussion of the pay gap. Your wage gap analysis is accurate with respect to differences in market compensation. It's dead on, I love it. However, you immediately jump to human capital formation as a matter of natural preference. The possibility of sexist cultural norms affecting personal interest, education, training, and general choice of career is simply not given due attention. Nor is the matter of sector or job-specific sexism that is masked by statistical aggregation. Say, sexism against one sex in one type of job, or career, and then sexism against another sex in another type of job or career. They negate each other statistically. You don't see that in the broad numbers. For one example, Lacey Green. Oh my gosh. Okay, listen, as far as I'm concerned, Lacey Green is the shit bottom of the intellectual barrel at best, and the epitome of mendacious fuckstick if she is not. Or both. But I do believe her when she talks about her childhood, her family history, her conservative Mormon upbringing, etc. I've seen that shit firsthand. It's real. Cultural norms are influential, and we can observe such influence on the decisions of individuals. We all do it every day. While its relative importance can be debated, this cannot be hand-waved or dismissed flippantly. We have to address these issues head on. Now, for the second major issue, there's what I only know to call the argument from postmodern experiential plight status. Or, in other words, not being a blah blah blah, he or she cannot understand yada yada. Now, if this were framed differently as a Socratic or Platonic critique, where you're turning the tables on them and revealing the internal contradictions of the theory, logical framework, Weltanschauung, whatever, most definitely the case with explicitly Marxist thinkers, then there wouldn't be a problem. We don't need to go down that road philosophically, as my actual complaint is related but distinct. Namely, that you take the position, their what you are, not who you are position, as valid, with all the presumptive capital T, quotation mark, theory, and identity determinants attending to this method of argumentation. Now, I'm the first to cop this. We all spend far too much time debating reasons for belief, and far too little time discussing reasons for truth. It's a wider social problem. Regardless, you're playing their identity games when you indulge in this rhetoric and form of argumentation, unless you're exclusively gesturing at the kind of Socratic or Platonic internal falsification that I mentioned. It's not obvious to me that you are. My last criticism, the most compelling to me, is the issue of economic welfare, particularly the disappearance or dissolution of the middle class. In short, it isn't. Perhaps I should preface my comments by saying that I'll be dealing with US figures in this video, which we'll have a much greater familiarity with. However, I have seen nothing in the literature to indicate a fundamentally different long-term trend for, say, the United Kingdom or Germany. You get the idea. If there are salient differences that I failed to address, I would love to hear about them. I just don't expect the issue to come up. I will start with a nice series of tables from Mark Perry using official U.S. Census data. Here we have a representation of the declining middle class, stylized as earning between $35,000 and $100,000, CPI adjusted for a 2013 benchmark. From the late 1960s to what is effectively the present, almost 10% of American households fell out of the middle class and into the upper class. Any genuinely falling into the lower class were more than matched by the poor moving into the upper class relative to the stated background. Of course, what's actually going on is that all kinds of people are economically mobile in a variety of ways, but the long-term net trend is clearly upward. But hell, even assuming complete income stagnation for the middle class membership fluctuates as people move through economic stages of their life cycle. Not that we need to make those assumptions because they would obviously be false. We can see that clearly in the data. It's not anywhere near that bad of a case. Again, not exactly the narrative that one hears from the economically illiterate mainstream media, but I repeat myself. Next, we have U.S. median household income, still census data, with the same CPI-adjusted 2013 benchmark and a nice upward trend, despite various biases against indicated improvements in welfare that usually come from using these specific figures, and these biases I will address shortly. Now, to assuage any suspicion of contravening economic trends that might distort our understanding of long-term welfare improvements, here are 3 more tables, relevant data starting with figures on the number of earners per household. As we can see, the trend is in the opposite direction of the conventional pessimistic narrative, bolstering the points that I made earlier. More obvious but equally relevant is the representation of retirees in the adult population, something which should come as little surprise but also strengthens the opposing narrative due to realistic expectations about the production and consumption levels of people in retirement. Here, finally, and most intuitively, we have an almost perfect correlation of income and work hours per household. It's almost uncanny in its fit. I mean, look at it. It's just beautiful. Now, to address the aforementioned biases, Richard Burkhauser at Cornell has done yeoman's work showing how pessimistically biased the widely circulated poverty and inequality numbers can be. By simply using households in lieu of tax units, he and fellow researchers arrived at strikingly different figures for income level, inequality, poverty. Mostly income level is what's relevant here. This is a comparison of growth figures using various metrics with the CPS or current population survey data. For your rhetorical word of the day, guess which set is typically used in the discussion of middle class or worker welfare? That's right, tax units, which paints a far bleaker picture of the gains made by the median American household. You might be familiar with the Piketty Say's numbers, and if so, I'll leave it for your estimation which metric they use with the correlative IRS data. If not, that's fine, as it was a rhetorical suggestion anyway. Now, particularly important about the figures on this table is the inclusion of estimated values for health insurance and adjustments for household size presented in the right-hand columns, 2 major factors in the illusion of stagnant household median income. The common use of median household income is misleading because it does not account for the decrease in household size or employer-provided benefits, particularly health insurance, which make up an increasingly substantial portion of a worker's total compensation. Now, I could also prattle on about the CPI relative to other measures of the price level, such as the PCE or GDP deflator, not to mention the suggestions by the Boskin Commission about how to adjust the CPI to make it more realistic, but I figure that would be a little too far in the weeds for a video of this nature. Oh, and you're also wrong about the economics of trade and immigration, but I will save that for another occasion.